Want to talk about today is, well, it's hardly an exaggeration to suggest now that we may be entering a third world war, unfortunately. And well, personally, I was convinced that pursuing a proxy war with Russia, the world's largest nuclear power, would be the peak of recklessness. But of course, we're also having a possible war with China as the one China policy is dismantled. But more pressing now is, of course, another war beginning in the Middle East over Gaza. And so I really wanted to focus on the Middle East today because, well, I guess in the past in the Middle East, the US and well, collective West largely had escalation control. That is, target one, while the other states could be deterred from joining in. But the West, and including the US, is somewhat weaker now, and the Middle Eastern states have grown more powerful. Also, this war and the destruction of Gaza is something very different, I think, from the previous wars. So I was just wondering, how do you read the situation? Has Israel and the United States overplayed their hand, or have they walked into something they can't control? What do you see the strategy being, and the risks, of course?
Well, whenever a nation state involves itself in conflict, they need to immediately shed the illusion of control. It's very difficult to foresee all circumstances, and that's why even the best strategist recognizes that goals and objectives have to adapt and change. I think the problem we have right now with both the government in Israel and the government in the United States is there really is no strategy per se. The Israelis are reacting to the events of 7 October. And I don't know of anyone anywhere who disagrees with the assertion that these acts were horrific and atrocious in every sense of the words. However, 3.5 weeks later, we're now watching as over 8,500 people in Gaza have been killed, of which at least 3,500 are children. And as I communicated to a friend in the Israeli Defense Force, I said, everybody understands the need to eradicate Hamas. The question is, first of all, can it be done under the circumstances? Is it realistic to do that? And then secondly, how is Israel's case helped when with each passing day, whatever memory there is of the horrific acts of Hamas against Israeli citizens is gradually erased by new horrific acts in Gaza caused by Israeli fire, largely airstrikes, but also some ground fire. I don't think there's an understanding of that right now. There's the view that there are no such things as civilians. Those are just combatants. And if they don't want to be combatants, then they should leave and go somewhere else. But we know that there are at least 500,000 people located inside northern Gaza because that's where they live and they really have nowhere else to go. And many have decided that they'd rather die at home in dignity than die in the desert somewhere. I don't think that particular set of circumstances really helps Israel's case at all. But I understand why the Israelis feel the way they do. The problem now is that in the United States, for many, many years, I would say decades, there has been a careful cultivation of not just support for Israel, but the readiness to effectively do whatever the Israelis think is appropriate. In other words, unconditional support for Israel without much question. This is a combination, I think, of two things. One is certainly money that is poured into the pockets of politicians on the Hill and into presidential campaigns by Israeli supporters who want to ensure that whatever we do, we always support Israel. And on the other hand, I think there's also the role that is played by Christian evangelists who are convinced that they have a holy obligation to fight for or support Israel. But the truth is, we do have an obligation to think about the United States and its interests. And I don't think we're giving that much thought at this point. Our war stocks are exhausted. We've shipped almost everything we possibly could to the Israelis in terms of, or excuse me, to the Ukrainians in terms of ammunition, along with a great deal of equipment. Our own forces are much smaller than they were in 1991. And yet there is this underlying assumption in everything that we do in Washington that we are largely unchanged from the nation of 1991, that our armed forces are effectively the same. They are not. We don't have much depth in our forces. And in Israel's case, the Israelis are going to be supported by us almost entirely by naval and air power. And we don't have the thousands of aircraft fighters that we once had. We don't have hundreds of bombers. Our inventories of missiles are not endless. So there has to be some thought about what the means and ends are. And by the way, if we're supporting the Israelis as we want to, are they doing things that would inadvertently bring us into conflict with other nations that, frankly, we don't necessarily want to fight? Where is our end in all of this? In other words, we want to support Israel. We want Israel to exist. I certainly sign up for that. But how much more do we want to do than simply help Israel defend itself? We're now about to do a great deal more, potentially, given the numbers of forces at sea that we've got in the Eastern Mediterranean, the high probability that we will send even more, probably to the Persian Gulf, the Indian Ocean, and that these naval forces could be used against forces that are not necessarily involved in the confrontation with Hamas. So I don't think people have thought all of this through. The other thing is that there's an assumption that nothing has changed in the Middle East. You know, if we go back to 1973, and I remember that very vividly, I was a cadet at West Point. And we ultimately followed what was happening in 1973 because people that were instructing us, officers, told us, you know, if the Israelis should collapse and the Egyptians or the Syrians should break through and move into the heartland of Israel, we could well be called upon to deploy and rescue the Israelis from destruction. Now, that didn't happen. Fortunately, the Israelis were able to master the situation. Today is different. The forces that the Israelis face are far more sophisticated, more complex. The populations in the region have changed insofar as they are more educated, more capable. There is new technology, new ways of waging war, and new actors on the scene. It's not just Iran, which is in its own right a large regional power. It's also Turkey, which, as you know, as a NATO member, has the largest armed forces in NATO just after the United States. And as far as its army is concerned, it has a different force from us and could mobilize 2 million men in the space of 30 to 40 days. So Turkey is a force to be reckoned with at sea, in the air, and on the ground. And there appears to be a willingness on the part of the Sunni Muslim Turks to actually cooperate with the Shiite Persians and Arabs, which has not been the case in the past. So the region strategically has evolved, and I don't think people are taking that into account.
So if this war would expand by other actors getting involved, how would you see the most likely scenario playing out? Because I got the impression that the Biden administration was pulling a little bit back after the meeting with Egypt, because it looked for a while that the U.S. and Israel might be pushing for pushing the entire Gaza population, cleansing it out of Gaza, pushing it into the Sinai of Egypt. But after the meeting with Egypt, it appears that the U.S. was committing itself to not displacing the population out from Gaza. So I'm just, but still, there's so many ways for this to escalate. Do you, how do you see this possibly moving forward? Because the Israelis will definitely continue into Gaza. Who's going to join in first? Will it be, West Bank, Hezbollah, one of the neighbors, Iran?
Well, the more hundreds each day of Palestinians who are killed or wounded, the worse the situation becomes regionally. Because today, thanks to new media that did not exist in 1973, the populations of the Middle East, of the entire Islamic world, from Morocco to Indonesia, can all watch in real time what's happening. And again, the memory of what happened in Israel on the 7th of October is now increasingly vanishing in the sea of destruction and casualties in Gaza. So that's a huge problem. And, you know, I ask again and again, how does it help to do what Israel is currently doing? I mean, the view is exactly what you said, effectively ethnically cleansing Gaza. Well, normally we Americans do not support ethnic cleansing. That's not something that we promote or accept. So the longer this goes on, the tougher it is to sell the idea that you just mentioned of simply pushing these people out. Secondly, I think that the closer we come to confrontation in northern Israel, especially with Hezbollah, the more likely we will see all of the Shiite militias in the region, as well as potentially Iran, become involved. And in Washington, there is almost a nonstop drumbeat for war with Iran. It's really quite disturbing. Again, there's no thinking, it's all emotion. Iran is at least in theory, the source of all evil. Therefore, it must be attacked and destroyed. The Russians are not going to sit quietly in the corner and watch Iran be destroyed by the United States Armed Forces. That's just not going to happen. And today, Iran is much more capable in terms of air defense weaponry and theater and tactical ballistic missiles, unmanned systems, you name it. So Iran is in a position to launch enough theater ballistic missiles that cities like Haifa and Tel Aviv could be reduced to ruins. That's something we have to take into account. Assumptions are that we will attack Iran before Iran gets a chance to do it. I would prefer that Iran stay out completely, which means I'd prefer that Hezbollah stayed out. Hezbollah has 140,000 of its own rockets and missiles and could easily destroy the city of Haifa, which sits right across from the Lebanese border. Then, of course, you have the problem that you mentioned in Egypt. General Sisi and the Egyptian government have worked very hard to maintain good relations with Israel. And Egypt has been a friend to the Israelis when it comes to dealing with Hamas. You know, a lot of people don't know, for instance, that during the Camp David Accords negotiations, Prime Minister Begin actually offered Gaza to President Sadat of Egypt. And Sadat said, no, thank you. We don't want Gaza. That's another entire kettle of fish that we can't cope with. Egypt is a huge country, but it has a population of what, 80 million plus, sitting on an infrastructure that could barely support half that number. Asking them to take in more people is not something the Egyptians can easily do without enormous financial and material support. But even then, the Egyptians would be viewed by everyone else in the region as having betrayed the Arab people and the Muslim cause. So I don't think the Egyptians can do that, but the Egyptian population is enraged right now for all the same reasons that we've been discussing. They see the number of more than 3,500 children killed by these bombings in Gaza, and they are infuriated. They've forgotten all about what precipitated this, which was the Hamas attack on Israel. He may not have much choice. His population may force him into a hostile posture vis-a-vis Israel. They may even say, why aren't you committing the Egyptian army to protect the people of Gaza from the Israelis? On top of that, you have Hezbollah that says, if you go into Gaza, we will attack. Well, the Israelis, instead of going in great force all at once, are now moving incrementally along several axes from time to time into Gaza. They're beginning to stay in some areas, but they haven't gone in massively. I think they're trying to conceal, the invasion, if you will, from being identified as such. I don't know that that's going to work. And if Hezbollah says, that's it, we're attacking because you've attacked our Muslim brothers in Gaza, then I would expect a complete uprising and a revolt on the West Bank. So that means the Israeli forces are tied up. Now, the expectation is that between our air power and offshore cruise missiles and so forth, we can support the Israelis against Hezbollah. Well, if we do that, then you're bringing in Iran and potentially Turkey, because the Turks are now, as you know from Mr. Erdogan's comments, regard this as a war crime, what Israel is doing in Gaza. They're going to present a case in The Hague, but we see a lot of evidence for readiness on the Turkish part to intervene. They have a very large navy. In fact, they have the same submarines, diesel-electric submarines that are built in Germany, very fine submarines, some of the best in the world, that the Israelis have. The Israeli submarines were built by the Germans. So you've got these submarines also in the Mediterranean. And right now, that's a very lethal threat to any surface fleet. And we have our own submarines in the Mediterranean. I don't see how you get past some sort of confrontation at sea. And once you begin sinking one another's ships, once you begin shooting down one another's aircraft, it's only a matter of time until the armies move. And I can tell you something, the IDF is very good. It cannot withstand the assault of the Turkish army. That's not going to happen. The Turkish military is excellent, and they are fierce fighters. And once committed, it's war to the finish. So it's hard to see a good way forward. And as we've said before, how does Russia deal with all of this? You know, the Russians actually accommodated Israeli security interests for many, many years in Syria. The Israelis made it very clear to the Iranians and to the Syrians that if Iranian forces were established on Syrian soil in any way, shape, or form, the Russians would not prevent the Israelis from launching strikes into Syria against those locations and those people. And so the Russians absolutely turned off their air defense radars and equipment and let the Israelis attack when the Israelis felt the need to do so. That is not going to happen in the future, for the very simple reason that Israel cast its lot with Ukraine. And the Russians are not going to forgive or forget that. They remember that the Iranians stood with them and supplied them with equipment, supplied them with unmanned systems, supplied them with raw materials, and Israel did everything in its power to help Ukraine. So the Russians are going to become involved if this conflict is not contained. And in the meantime, the Peninsular Arabs, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, all of them have no choice but to rise up as one against Israel. And I think that's too much for Israel. And if you're like me, and I want to make sure that the Israeli state survives and doesn't end up looking like Ukraine, then I think we need a different way forward. And the other thing is that, and many Israelis who are astute observers of the scene point this out, Hamas is not just a group of fighters. It's not just 10,000, 20,000, 30,000, 40,000 fighters. It's an idea. Killing an idea is much more difficult than killing people. You can kill people for a very long time, but killing off ideas doesn't work nearly as well. The way you defeat an idea is by offering a better alternative. And right now, from the standpoint of the Palestinian Arabs, and from the standpoint of many of the people in the region, there is no better alternative to fighting and dying. And that's not a good thing. And again, that's a no-win situation for the Israelis. So I don't have any easy solutions. I'm just sitting here wondering when the president of the United States is going to exert some leadership. You know, we had a conference in Egypt not long ago with many of the great powers represented, as well as the various Arab states. And that conference was an effort to come to terms with the problem. Many of the people walked out saying we have to have a two-state solution. Others said different things. But the point is, it was an attempt to do something, but we were not there. Oh, we had representation, but the president and his leaders in his cabinet were not there. When are they going to step up and recognize that this is a very dangerous situation? And all the air and naval power that we have is not going to be enough if all of the states that I mentioned earlier weigh into this combat. And finally, and this is something I'm very sad to admit, we have no army to send. What we have in the United States Army that has any combat power is sitting in Poland, Lithuania, Romania, Moldova. Moving it in any sort of timely manner is almost impossible. And if you can't put a substantial ground force into the region, air and naval power will not be decisive. Air and naval power alone will not decide conflicts and decide outcomes. Of course, now then the question is, what about nuclear weapons? I still see no evidence that anyone in Washington, Moscow, or Beijing thinks that's a good idea. But you've got a couple of wild cards. Of course, you've got the Israelis who have nuclear weapons. And then you have the Turks, who have been promised access to nuclear warheads whenever they want that access by Pakistan. Which means that if the Turks decided we're going to get into this fight, they may well turn to the Pakistanis for those warheads so that they can deter the Israelis from using their nuclear weapon. This is not a good situation, Glenn. And historically, American presidents have usually intervened and said, that's it, stop. We did that in 1973. We exerted similar influence in 1967. And back during 1956, during the Suez Crisis. Where is the leadership from the United States? All I see is reaction, emotion, and the readiness to essentially do unconditionally whatever the Israelis ask us to do. And I don't think that's a good policy position to be in.
Yeah, you mentioned that the reactions from Russia were more cold now towards Israel, and well, I picked up on that as well, because I remember I met Israeli former Prime Minister Olmert 5 years ago in Kazakhstan, and he was speaking very strongly about how the Israelis and Russians would be intimately close for pretty much in perpetuity, that this was very strong relationship ever since the Second World War. Well, then with the Jewish people, of course, but and I also noticed that Russia's always been very careful to have a balanced view, and not to speak too harshly against the Israelis. But obviously, after Israel provided support for Ukraine, a lot of Russians saw this as a stab in the back, and I was also even a bit surprised by the more strong language now that I hear from not just Putin but other people close to the Kremlin about the actions of Israel. So I was also wondering then, how do you see this war in Gaza or Israel impacting the other war we're having now in Europe? Because obviously first impact would be that a lot of artillery shells and weapons which were promised to Ukraine was then redirected to Israel, which is of course a higher priority for the United States. But are there any other ways this will have an impact on the Ukraine war?
Well, let's be frank about the Ukraine war, if you want to call it that. That's lost. The Ukrainians lost that war a long time ago, and there were several of us at the very beginning of this that warned that whatever the Ukrainians did, they could not possibly prevail against Russia. And we worried a great deal about the readiness on the part of the United States and other NATO countries to effectively intervene in Ukraine itself on behalf of this Ukrainian government. Fortunately, that has not happened. But we've spent billions of dollars essentially supporting the regime there, equipping its armed forces, propping it up. So have other NATO members, to no avail. We think there are 500,000 Ukrainian dead Ukrainian soldiers. We don't know how many were wounded, but we know the hospitals are full. We don't know what the actual population is at this point, because so many Ukrainians have fled the country who could get out. Ukraine is finished, to be blunt. The kindest thing that we could do right now is to suspend any more military aid in favor of only humanitarian support, and to ask for an audience with the Russians and encourage our European allies to do the same and come to an agreement. But that involves standing up publicly in Washington and saying, we were wrong. Nobody will do that. Nobody will admit defeat. Now, Newsweek, which is not exactly a right of center journal or magazine by any stretch of the imagination, has now published an article about Zelensky. Zelensky just a few months ago was a hero of the West, the man of the hour who is going to save everyone from the Russians. Now he's being sort of scorned. He's become an object of derision he's finished. One wonders how much longer he will wait till he flies to one of his villas in Venice or Miami or somewhere else. And of course, the theft, the corruption, the human trafficking, everything that you can imagine that is wrong in a society is absolutely out of control in Ukraine, which is something many also warned about when this war began. And as I'm sure you're aware, we found lots of weapons that we provided to the Ukrainian army that have shown up into the hands of Hamas and presumably Hezbollah, and probably in the hands of others who we would prefer they not have those weapons. So I think Ukraine is finished, but we are going to send billions of dollars to maintain the fiction that it's alive. And we will keep that fiction alive, presumably through the next election. And after the next election, there'll be an admission, well, that's over. It's time to move on. I mean, I don't know if you remember it, but and it may not have been you, Glenn, but several people asked me, when this thing in Ukraine ends, what will we do? And I always said the same thing. What did we do at the end of the Vietnam War? We left and we changed the subject. And the subject here is already changing. It is now Israel, Israel, Israel. Ukraine is a distant memory. And the Republicans, or so-called Republicans on the Hill, who are advocates for war in Ukraine, have now said, well, it's time to separate spending for Ukraine from spending for Israel, privately because they know it's lost and they don't want to spend any more money. There are some Democrats who feel the same way, but the Democrats want to maintain the fiction through the election, to insist that something good has happened in Ukraine when it hasn't. And everyone is shifting to Israel now. And everyone is backing Israel, which makes sense because we have a long relationship with Israel. I like Israel. I like the Israelis, and I'm neither an evangelizing Christian nor am I a Jew. I think Israel deserves to exist. But we haven't answered the first order questions about strategy. What do we want out of this? What do we want the region to look like when it's over? You know, where are we going to adjust our expectations and goals so that we have something that is practically attainable and achievable? Because at the end of this, we would like Israel to exist. We're not looking at that. We're not asking those questions. We're not pursuing any strategy geared to that outcome. We're pursuing a strategy of confrontation, the way we did in Ukraine. Constant, uninterrupted confrontation at the expense of the Ukrainian people. We're doing it now with Israel. And that's why I'm concerned that at the end of this process, Israel may look like Ukraine, which I don't think is something we want to happen.